the blood sacrifice I have spoken of again and again. That is us. This is the No Fear Podcast. We know what scares you. I'm Matt.
I'm Mel.
And I'm Lisa. And this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is season 2, episode 21, our last episode in our series on the vampire. The opening quotation is from Preacher, the graphic novel by Garth Ennis and Steve Dillon. We are joined with author Tom Deady, our 4th co-host for this episode. Tom Deady's first novel, Haven, won the 2016 Bram Stoker Award for Superior Achievement in a First Novel. Tom's second novel, Eternal Darkness, was released in early 2017. His novella, Weekend Getaway, is now available from Grinning Skull Press. He also has a young adult series he is seeking agent representation for. Tom has a master's degree in English and creative writing from SNHU, and he resides in Massachusetts, where he is working on his next novel. His next release is a 2-novella collection out in September from Omnium Gatherum. You can read more about him at his website, tomdeady.com. All right, so as we mentioned in our introduction, we are here with a 4th co-host for this last episode on the vampire, Tom Deady. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
We're excited. This vampire series has been really fun. And, of course, we couldn't cover as much as we wanted to. But we kind of ended our last episode talking about the romantic vampire and how it is kind of a Byronic figure, and it's always had those roots. But you write something a little bit different, don't you?
I do. My vampire is more old school, I guess. I mean, it's the setting is modern times, but the vampire is more of a monster than a romantic, I guess.
So I have to ask, because I think Matt and Mel agree with me. We like our vampires to be monsters. If you had to pick kind of the model for the monstrous vampire, what would it be?
You know, I'm kind of a big fan of the older stuff. I think a lot of the newer movies and books try too hard to put a new spin on it. I would go old school with like Kolchak the Night Stalker. The movie version of the vampire was a good vampire.
Mel, you're familiar with Kolchak, right?
Yeah, more the TV show than the movie.
Okay. I thought I remembered you like prodding me to watch it several times.
Yeah, I guess I'm a little bit older than you guys. So the show got really campy, but the 2 movies that were based with the same Kolchak character were actually pretty good. One was the Night Stalker, one was the Night Strangler, and the Night Stalker vampire was a pretty badass vampire.
So, I mean, again, you're going to have to like fill me in on this, but what about the Kolchak vampire?
Just what you like as far as it being a monster and being driven to survive only. And there wasn't as much of a human side, and there definitely wasn't a romantic side to it.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, that's something that's really interesting, because in a lot of monsters, there is kind of a humanity to them. That they kind of walk back and forth between, I'm thinking of werewolves right now, which are kind of go hand in hand with vampires. But werewolves have that definite, during the day, they're going to be human, and at night they're going to be monster. And so you can see how that tension plays up. But then sometimes the vampires are solely just these evil creatures. I mean, sometimes
Right.
They're just solely out for blood, and they lose all that humanity. Which I don't know, that's a completely different thing than what you get with these romantic vampires. Like we were talking before the podcast about Anne Rice and what she did, because you can't talk about vampires and not talk about Anne Rice. Because there was kind of a revival, I guess, in the vampire, even though the vampire's always been kind of stalking literature and film and television. But she, I think, brought them to the forefront for a little bit. And she tried to play up that humanity of the vampire. And I don't know. Matt, you were saying something interesting about Anne Rice and her vampires.
Oh, you want me to go ahead and get on my soapbox about Anne Rice then?
I do. That's why I was throwing that to you.
Well, like I was saying before we started recording, I think I read Interview with the Vampire when I was in like 8th or 9th grade, and I read a few of the other ones that followed it, The Vampire Lestat, and I think Queen of the Damned, and maybe one other. And I liked them at the time, and I mean, I guess I don't dislike them that much now. The problem I have with Anne Rice is that Louis in Interview with the Vampire is just, he comes off as whining. And I get that she's trying to go with the tortured. He doesn't want to be a vampire. He doesn't want to drink blood. He's conflicted. And I get that. But really, after that book, it sort of takes this turn where she focuses on Lestat. And, I mean, I wouldn't even call it a Mary Sue character so much as I think the phrase I used before we started the recording was that it's like unlocking God mode in the video game, where Lestat just sort of becomes this unstoppable, godlike character who has no flaws and can do no wrong. And I mean, it's not interesting for me to read that, you know. I think that's my biggest quibble with Anne Rice there. It's not even so much the overly romantic, and I mean, it's very, I mean, all of her books with vampires, and I mean, I can't speak to the others because I haven't read them, but I mean, there is that very sexual aspect to them, and I don't have a problem with that. I don't find Lestat interesting. It's boring reading about a god, essentially. So
yeah, I kind of agree with Matt. When I read Interview with the Vampire, it was also a very long time ago. And as you mentioned, it brought vampires back to the forefront, but it was also probably the beginning of their evolution into more of a human character, I think. And I don't know, I just never was a big fan of her books. And, you know, they're so long and there's so much history in there that, I don't know. To me, it gets a little boring, but I'm probably in the minority in that opinion.
No, I agree. Well, and Matt, kind of going along with what you were saying too about Lestat just kind of being a little bit of a flat character. In Interview with the Vampire, and I can't remember the other vampire's name right now. It's flying out of my head.
it was Louis.
Louis. Thank you. You know, that novel seemed to be more about him, I guess, because he was the titular vampire. But, you know, because it is this struggle between humanity and monstrosity, I guess. And that was interesting to me. And then when she moves into her other books and she focuses more on Lestat, I was just like, you're focusing on the wrong one.
Right.
He did feel kind of flat to me, which is really interesting because Lestat is the one that they're resurrecting now. And her son, Christopher Rice, is involved in work that I guess is turning the vampire Lestat into a TV series. I mean, he's been posting a lot about it on social media. I don't know if anything is definite yet, but I know that's in the works. So I'm curious to see if there's anything new and different to be done there. Because I'm kind of doubtful.
Right. Same.
But, yeah, I don't know. That's, you know, when it was turned into a movie, it was a beautiful movie. But I was like you. I thought everything other than Lestat was a little bit better. Louis was a more interesting character. Heck, I love the idea of the child vampire. who really turns out to be the least humane of them all. And I love that idea of that innocence being corrupted so completely.
Right.
Well, and not just
I
innocence
love that.
corrupted. I had forgotten about that until you just mentioned it, but I think it's played by Kirsten Dunst in the movie. Am I right?
Oh, and she's completely angelic,
Yeah.
you know, because she's got like the blonde curls and the blue eyes, and yeah.
Well, that was a very interesting idea because she makes a big point of it in the book, of how, because she is turned into a vampire when she's so young, her mind continues to age and she grows with experience, but her body is dead, so it stops aging. And so, you know, after a while, she's this like 100-year-old thing in the body of like a 10-year-old or however old she was. And I thought that was a pretty fascinating idea too, that, you know, she's always going to be looked at by people who don't know her as this child, when in fact she's far more knowledgeable than the adults around her.
Yeah, that's a good point. And that completely corrupts the idea of what is supposed to be so alluring about the vampire, is the fact that the vampire can offer you eternal life and this kind of eternal youth and beauty. But I guess if it hits at the wrong time, you know, it's not what she got very angry at being stuck in her youth forever, kind of this prepubescent little girl. And, you know, now that I think about it, because I always imagine if I was to turn vampire, I would somehow go back to like my 25-year-old self. And I don't think I would want to spend eternity in like a nearly 40-year-old body. Like, that doesn't sound fun.
That is really a fascinating twist there. I had forgotten completely about that.
Yeah.
Well, if I'm remembering, and again, like for all of us, it's been a while. I think Louis was the one who turned her because I think she was dying of, you know, she got some sort of disease or something and was dying, and so he did it to save her. And so of course that presents more conflict for him as a character. He did this thing to save her life, but in doing so pretty much created a worse monster, because as time goes on, like you said, Lisa, she gets more and more angry, and that rage kind of drives her insane a bit because of her situation. So
I thought Lestat turned her to control Louis more. Was that?
Well, I think either way she was dying. It might have been Lestat who turned her. But
you're right. I was just thinking like Lestat was kind of trying to control both of them because they create the companions after they've been alone for so long and that sort of thing.
I think you may be right. I think you may be right on that. But either way, I mean, there is this at least illusion of doing it for a good reason. Mm-hmm. At least that's what maybe that's what Lestat presented to Louis as the reasoning. I don't know. It's been like 20 years.
Yeah, it's been a long time.
It's been a while.
We've read many more vampires since then.
So many.
Well, I'm going to use that as a good segue out of Anne Rice, because I don't want this to be an entire episode on Anne Rice. And since at least the movie came out in like the 90s, didn't it? The Interview with the Vampire. Mm-hmm. And another 90s favorite vampire, at least for me, that is now seeing renewal is Preacher, the graphic novel from Garth Ennis and Steve Dillon, which is now a really great TV show on AMC. And I don't even know if he adds anything to the vampire lore or mythos, except he's just an awesome character. Are you guys familiar at all with Preacher?
I am not.
Yeah, I'm not either.
Well, it's my time to shine then.
There you go. Take it away, Matt.
Now, I read the comics. I've read them several times. I love them. I have to confess I haven't seen too much of the TV show yet. It's one of those, like, it's in my list of things to watch. I just haven't had the time yet. But I think you're right, Lisa, that Cassidy doesn't... I mean, he's not really so much a new twist on the vampire itself so much as... I think what I liked about the character is that he's not a monster. I mean, he drinks blood. He's a vampire. He's been alive for about 100 years. But he's not so much a monster like, say, some later incarnations of vampires, so much as he is just a jerk. I mean, I'm trying to keep our PG-13 sort of rating here, but he's not so much a monster as he is just kind of an asshole, Like,
well, and I think he even say that at one point in the comics. I think he says, I'm the arsehole.
Yes, pretty much. And so I always found it interesting that Preacher itself is just such a wonderfully weird story to begin with, and Cassidy is one of the main characters, but he's not the only main character, and he's the only vampire really that shows up, to my knowledge, except for maybe a few here and there. So it's not like a vampire story in the sense of like Dracula or Anne Rice. He just sort of is a vampire, and they just kind of go along with that. And then there's some great moments of him getting caught out in the sun or stuff like that, but I don't think he adds anything so much to the lore per se.
And as far as I can tell, the fact that he's a vampire doesn't really help the course of the story either.
No, I wouldn't say it does, but it is interesting.
Because I think he could just be a jerky Irishman otherwise.
Right.
But
well,
he's still one of my favorites.
Well, I kind of wanted to take, since we're kind of talking about 90s stuff, and I know this didn't really come up in our pre-recording discussions and stuff, but speaking of sort of monstrous incarnations of vampires, we touched on Buffy the Vampire Slayer, the movie, but they flesh out that vampire lore a lot more in the Buffy show and in Angel. And one of the things that I always loved about that kind of lore is that the vampires in those shows are, like, when you get turned into a vampire, your soul actually leaves and is damned to hell. So your body's still walking around, but your soul is actually gone. And that is their explanation for why these vampires become such monstrous, callous, willful disregard of everything. Like, they just don't care about human life because they don't have a soul anymore. I always found that to be an interesting explanation for why they go about that change.
Yeah, I mean, when you're talking about these vampires and you're creating these characters, I guess, as a writer, you have two choices. Either the vampires are just monsters from the beginning and they just come from some sort of monstrous race that happens to look semi-human, or they're humans who turned into monsters. And I think that is a really interesting explanation for why they turned that way. I guess I really hadn't thought about why just suddenly turning into a vampire would make you... I mean, I understand, like, okay, it makes you crave blood. It makes you stay up all night. I get that. But why it would automatically turn you into a monster, Like, why...
Why aren't vampires happy?
Right. I mean, and maybe that's why I like Cassidy from Preachers, because he's essentially the same person he was. He's like, well, I'm going to keep on drinking and I'm going to keep on gambling and I'm going to keep on sleeping with women and doing drugs.
Pretty much. Now I don't have to worry about heroin killing me because I'm already
right. Exactly. He's just like, I don't see any downside to this. But then you have these other vampires, that are monsters, and what makes them turn from human into monster. And if you don't have a soul, that would be one explanation. I don't know. I hadn't really thought about what the other explanations would be.
I hadn't really considered it either, but that is a pretty interesting take on it.
It was actually one of the reasons why, like, my first feelings towards Buffy and Angel when they were airing was to roll my eyes and go, ugh, the WB, and ugh, teenage drama. Because I didn't know anything about the shows, and I watched them later. I came into Joss Whedon's universes through Firefly and kind of worked my way backwards, and I found that I really liked the show Angel once I got over the fact that David Boreanaz is just kind of, he's not just a pretty boy. I mean, he is, but the character in the show is like the whole lore behind it is that he, as a vampire, was cursed by some gypsy woman to have his soul back. And it creates this conflict where he's now feels remorse for all the horrific things that he's done for several hundred years, that torturing and killing people and, you know, all these horrible things that he was soulless at the time, and so it didn't matter to him. And then now he actually has a conscience again. And so it becomes a sort of redemption story. And I always found that interesting as like, oh, that really does provide an interesting conflict of how do you live with the guilt of the stuff that you did when you weren't fully in control of yourself, but you kind of were. Like, you're still kind of responsible because it was still you, but it wasn't. And I don't know, I always found that interesting.
I find that super interesting, and I'm very glad that you told me that, because now I have that and I don't have to watch Angel.
Have you never watched Angel? I could have sworn that you had.
No.
I haven't either.
And I have no plans to.
Well, it's not my favorite Joss Whedon thing. That would be Firefly for sure. But I prefer Angel to Buffy as just a personal thing. I like Buffy. It's a good show. But if I had my choice of the two, I'd prefer to watch Angel more often than not. But
Yeah.
Again, it's not. It's still not my favorite. Firefly is that one. So, but there's no vampires in that. So sadly, we'll have to talk about that another day.
That is really interesting, the idea of losing your soul, like what makes you human, and then you can be the vampire. Because, I mean, how else, like you were saying earlier, Lisa, like how else could you become a vampire? Is a vampire just is it a pure monster, like another species? Is it a parasite? Is it a disease or a contagion? I think we mentioned that in the last episode. I hadn't really thought of it. It's like here's a vampire, like you said, they're immortal and they're afraid of light and they bite people and take their blood. But what is that catalyst that makes them that way or creates them? Like, is there a tension between them and humanity, or are they something that's not even human?
Yeah, that's interesting. So when I wrote Eternal Darkness, I took a lot of liberties on the traditional vampire lore, and I actually made them another species of humanity. So they're not undead. The true bloodline of the vampire is not undead. It's just another species. And some of the inherited traits of those species are, extreme sensitivity to sunlight. There's an actual disease that people are sensitive to sunlight. So I just created an extreme version of that where they can't be exposed to sunlight. And, I don't know. I tried to make the possibility of a vampire more believable, the whole suspension of disbelief thing, by trying to use some science to explain why they are what they are. I don't know. I'm not sure if I pulled it off, but that was my take.
So tell me a little bit more about this disease that you researched.
Oh, God, I can't remember the name of it. I'm going to have to Google it real quick because it's got like this Latin name that I probably can't pronounce anyway. It's like photo something. Let's see. Guard, talk amongst yourselves while I look this up. I'm sorry.
Well, no, I mean, the idea of, I mean, we've talked about this, but the idea of disease and vampires makes sense. Kind of like with zombies, that if there were some disease that humans could pass from one person to another that would affect you in some sort of way, I could see how that would change, maybe take away the possibility of evil, but change your brain enough that you would not be the same person. That would be really interesting.
That is, I don't know how familiar any of you are with The Strain, but have you seen the show or read the books?
I read the first book, and I saw, I guess, the first season.
Okay.
I don't know, did it go past the first season?
Yes, I think it's on season 3 now.
Okay.
I've seen the first 2 seasons. I haven't read the books, but that's their take. I know we're jumping ahead time-wise a little bit, but I mean, that is their take. Guillermo del Toro and Chuck Hogan,
right.
I think. That's their take on the vampires, that it is a legitimate, essentially a disease, like a parasitic sort of thing that is spread like a disease through contact with these I don't even want to call them vampires so much as vampiric things.
But they are.
Because, well, yeah, I mean, and the head, the master vampire is very much like an actual vampire in the classical sense that we think of, but a lot of these other vampires are a little bit closer to like inhuman monsters, not quite zombies, but closer. They don't seem to have that sense of consciousness, I guess, except for when the master gives it to them. So, but it's a really interesting show, and I keep meaning to sit down and read the books as well. But I just wanted to throw that out there in terms of stuff with contagions and vampires.
All right, so you ready for my terrible pronunciation of long multisyllabic words?
Yeah, we're ready.
Erythropoietic protoporphyria is an allergy to light exposure. There's also like photophobia, and another name is polymorphous light eruption, and that's just more of the result of people that are sensitive to it, which is kind of like a nasty rash, extreme sunburn type thing. So I just took that and said, what if there's, a version of this that's superpowered and people can't go into the light at all? And that would explain why they're obviously vampires only come out at night. And I used a lot of made up science to explain why they need to drink blood versus, so my vampires can eat food, but they need to drink blood to survive. So there's, like I said, I took a lot of liberties and mixed and matched a lot of the traditional character traits and made them fit what I wanted my vampire to look like.
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting. I know, I see why you had to look it up now, though.
Yeah.
It's not something that's going to just sit in your brain.
It's not on the tip of your tongue, no.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that is interesting, especially, there's a fear of any kind of infection or virus, because there's a wild nature to it, right? Where it can come in and it can infect anyone. And, that was one of the things we talked about in our last episode when we were talking about some of the things that people were afraid of. And it's easy to understand that as a virus.
Right.
Kind of like in Lost Boys, you worry about your children falling in with the wrong crowd because they have a bigger influence.
Right.
But what I really find fascinating too is like, if this is some sort of illness or disease, what could come out of it? And I guess I'm thinking of the strain too, Matt, since you brought that up, which I think is a good one to talk about. But the idea that even illnesses, even viruses can be manipulated, and they can sort of be controlled. On a small level, you can choose to infect whomever you want to infect. But on a bigger level, you hear about things like viral warfare being used by countries. And you start thinking about that on like a bigger scale with a vampire. And if the vampire is the infection, certainly with somebody like something in the strain, and where you have like a head person over everybody, it starts to take on a different, more sinister feel to it, because suddenly it doesn't feel wild and random anymore. It feels much more organized. And
yes, organized and targeted.
Yes. Yeah.
But, it's funny you bring that up, because I forget where I read it, but somebody did the math and said, well, if vampires had to feed once a day, so they had to bite a person once a day and turn that person, everyone would be a vampire within like 2 years or something ridiculous.
Yeah.
So we have to just forget about that possibility.
What, didn't they do a movie where that actually was happening? And they had to farm humans, like the vampires had to farm humans to keep the blood supply going.
Oh,
that
yeah.
rings a bell. Yeah, I can't remember what that was, though.
Willem Dafoe and Ethan Hawke, and the name of the movie is escaping me, but I know exactly what you're talking
Daybreakers.
about. That's the one.
I had to go back.
Wow.
Go back
Good
in the
call.
brain files for that. Yeah, no, because that is an interesting thing, is that if vampires are really successful at what they're doing, then, yeah, eventually their food source is going to go away.
Right.
Which I guess some people have been trying to do. I mean, there was that movie Daybreakers where the humans were literally just kind of, blood donors. They were just hanging there, being drained of their blood and kept alive long enough to keep it going. And then shows like True Blood, which was based on that Charlaine Harris book series, which I don't know if it's a great example of vampire fiction, but she did have that synthetic blood that they had invented, which allowed them kind of to come out of the shadows, so to speak, and live amongst humans, because they were like, oh, we're not a threat to you anymore. We can drink this synthetic stuff. So it's really interesting to think about just the logistics of having a real vampire around you, and how that would work and what it would look like.
There was another show that did a spin on that. It was probably 10 years ago now, and it didn't last long. It was about this gated community, and some of the people were vampires, and there were witches and werewolves, and there was all kinds of things. But the vampires actually kept blood supplies that I don't remember if they were stealing them from hospitals or where they were getting them, so they didn't have to feed on people. They could just drink these bagged bloods, like vampire TV dinners, kind of.
I feel like they did that on Being Human, the vampire.
I don't remember that one.
Yeah, Being Human, there was a British version. It was a TV show a while back, and then they did an American version. I think Sci-Fi put it out.
It was a ghost, a vampire, and a werewolf living together, basically. Yeah,
it kind of sounded like a corny joke, but
yeah,
it was good. Yeah, it wasn't. It was. I mean, as vampires go, that one was pretty good.
See, I have a problem with things, and that's probably why I didn't like the Twilight stuff, or one of the many reasons I didn't like it. Is I'm big into the whole suspension of disbelief thing, and if you can get a reader to be afraid of something like a vampire, to instill fear that this could happen and make them truly afraid, that's one thing. But when you start throwing in, okay, so if you've got vampires and werewolves and witches and all these other things, it just becomes kind of corny.
Yeah. I brought up the True Blood series, and I watched it for a long while, and I read the books. And when she started bringing in fairies, I was like, I'm done.
There you go. Yeah.
I'm done. I can't do this anymore. There is something about it that feels like if they're going to be real, then it just has to be them.
Right, exactly.
Oh.
I wanted to go back to your comment about how a vampire among humans would really survive, and that. I don't know if you guys have seen, this is kind of off on a tangent, Santa Clarita Diet.
Yes.
Oh my
I
God.
love it.
It is so great, but it's not a vampire, it's a zombie, but it kind of fits what we were talking about.
I actually thought of that as well a little while ago, and didn't mention it for that exact reason, that it's more zombie than vampire, but it really does sort of fit in. And listeners, if you have not seen it, it's a Netflix show, and the writing on it, it's hilarious, while at the same time it's very tightly written.
It's very dark comedy, but it is
very
funny.
Dark.
And I would watch Timothy Olyphant in anything, because I think he's
yes.
great. So.
I agree. Well, that was one thing, and I think we've mentioned it a long time ago on this podcast, but how vampires and zombies really are kind of the same creature. Like they're two sides of the same coin because they both cannibalize humans. They both were once human. They're both called the undead. One just has a cape and suave accent, I guess. And the other one just kind of drools. But
other than that, they're identical.
I mean, they really kind of are.
No, that is a good point. There are a lot of similarities. I have a book that I started a while ago, and it was more of a, zombie type, post-apocalyptic. The people that are left are zombie-ish, I guess. And I wrote a scene where before the world completely falls apart, that these two people took over a TV station, and they're arguing about whether or not the people left, if they're zombies or vampires. And I don't know, I thought it was a kind of funny scene. Like, they're yelling at each other, like, if it was a vampire, it couldn't come out in the day. But if it was a zombie, it would be just walking around slow, eating brains. And like, they're having this like attempted rational argument about something that's just so irrational.
I really kind of like that.
Yeah.
Though, that's something we've talked about too, is that, if you're aiming for realism, when you're writing a scene like that, number one, your characters don't know what's happening.
Right.
When things are really hitting the fan, you don't know what's happening. You don't know if it's widespread. You don't know if it's the end of the world. You don't know, what the nature of the monster is, or if it's just some guy who's been sniffing bath salts and is now coming after you. I mean, you don't know.
Right.
And you probably would have, in a moment where you at least felt safe, and could kind of collect your thoughts, your brain would not be able to process what was happening, and you would probably be having these absurd conversations.
Yeah, and of course you're going to try and rationalize it to something that you perceive to be real. Like, what if you read a story tomorrow in the newspaper that there's a vampire running around, Los Angeles? You'd be like, yeah, it's just some crazy guy that smelled too many bath salts or whatever. And because that's the obscurity of the monsters in most stories is what keeps them alive in a lot of cases, because nobody wants to believe in them.
Yeah, that's a good point. This idea of obscurity, especially, to monsters in general, but specifically to vampires, since that's what we're talking about, seems to be the way things are going, which I like. Because one thing that struck me as we were talking, when you were talking about the differences between the vampires and the zombies, and we were kind of making jokes, but then I started thinking, one real difference is that, at least in really early vampire lore, it was always connected to some sort of like Catholicism or Christianity. The crucifix can scare them away,
right,
type of thing. And the zombie never really had that. But we've lost that almost completely. Like, all of the ones we've been talking about, a stake through the heart, or chopping off their head, or pushing them out into the sun will probably kill them. But we've lost this whole kind of religious ties to it. And I think that's due to the fact that these monsters are becoming more kind of obscure in the way, we're not defining them as much, because that makes them more scary.
I think that's a great point. And to be honest, I kind of miss the more traditional lore that did involve, Catholicism or religion and the crucifix and all that. But I think it's just another attempt to mainstream the vampire and kind of shed the cloak of religion away from it, and just make it more of either a monster or this human monster, whatever you want to call it. But yeah, I miss the old capes and crosses and all that stuff.
Yeah, that was kind of fun.
Yeah.
But man, oh, go ahead, Matt.
Well, I was going to say, to kind of turn it a little bit the other direction, speaking of obscure vampires, I want to do this because we're beginning to run short on time a little bit, and I want to make sure that we talk about one of my favorites, which is 30 Days of Night.
Yes.
and I mean, I think that fits that obscure vampire in the sense of remote location, since it takes place in, it's Alaska.
It's Alaska, right.
Where, they're on the eve of this, well, like the title says, 30 Days of Night, because of how far north it is, that the sun's about to be gone for 30 days, and that just happens to be when the vampires roll into town. And I like kind of how that take on it is in terms of obscurity, the sense that they have managed to survive by staying in these places where, in these extreme climates where the sun doesn't rise very often, as a matter of survival. Plus, if you kill an entire tiny town in Alaska, the news isn't going to really get out. And when it does, they're not going to say, hey, it was a vampire that did this, or vampires, because it's a gang of them. But
yeah, I'm glad you brought that one up. Two things. First, the concept was brilliant for them to invade this town when it's going to be pretty much night for a whole month. I thought that was just a genius concept. But also, the vampires in that movie were outstanding. They were great monsters.
Yes. And I have not read the source material. I haven't read the comics
I have not
that it's
either.
based on. But I know that in casting the vampires, I don't know if it was the casting director or the director himself who came up with the idea, but they specifically looked for people who had shark-like faces, like that their heads were shaped sort of like sharks, because they really wanted to go for that predatory look, which I'd say they achieved, for sure.
Oh, they did a great job. I agree.
I mean, as far as monstrous vampires go, that's probably one of the best examples, in my opinion. I was not sure if I'd like the movie, because I'm not a huge Josh Hartnett fan, but yeah, they did a great job with it.
They really did. That was a good one. Good call.
Yeah, that goes along with, Tom, what you were talking about, the suspension of disbelief and how you have to, set up something realistic enough for your readers to buy into these monsters, and just having it, like you guys were talking about, the setting of it was, for me, what allowed me to buy the monsters coming in, because I thought, well, yeah, of course.
Right?
Of course, this is where they're going. And just the way they would kind of have their own language and speak to each other in this weird...
Yeah, that whole guttural noise. Yeah, that was so creepy. That was really well done.
That was I need to rewatch that movie.
Me too.
I was just thinking.
So glad you brought it up.
We're all like, let's hurry up and end this podcast so we can go. Yeah, I mean, yeah. As far as creepy vampires go, I think that's probably at the top for me. For just gives me nightmares. Is that movie. Just the way they look, the sounds they make. I also got really creeped out reading Andy Davidson's In the Valley of the Sun.
Oh, I have that, and I haven't read it yet.
We won't spoil anything.
I've heard great things.
But I think it may be he just gives you enough detail that your brain kind of fills in the rest. And sometimes that's more terrifying than seeing an actual monster on screen.
Oh, definitely.
So I think those may be my top two, scariest monsters that are vampire or vampire adjacent, I will say. So
I have one, but I don't know how to classify it. So in the Will Smith version of I Am Legend, are they zombies or vampires?
We've had this debate.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Matt, Mel, did we agree?
We always go back and forth.
Back when I was still teaching, did a couple of classes that was centered around zombies, and that movie had was fairly recent at the time. Like, it had been out for maybe a year or two, and we spent an entire class period because somebody brought it up, and I was like, let's have this debate. What are they? And we finally settled on zombies. So, it's a little bit of both was kind of where that class of people decided to land, because it's a hard call, because they really are, like, the I don't know the word for it, but the photophobia, I guess. They can't go out in daylight, but they seem a bit more mindless, like a zombie. I don't know.
Right,
Vampire
right.
zombies.
But whatever they are, they're pretty scary.
Yeah.
Well, I think Matheson uses the term vampire in the book, doesn't he?
I think in the source material, they're vampires.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that has gotten muddled.
It's changed, yeah. And even in the book, you could make an argument for either way. It's just that guy's interpretation of what they are, the guy that's left.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I know we're nearing the end, and so I want to push us into, I guess, another area. But one thing that I do like about the vampire lore is how, and we kind of talked about it a little bit. It kind of backfired in the Anne Rice with the little girl being turned vampire. But I love the idea of how you can have something that doesn't necessarily look like a monster, or that should not have the power or strength of a monster, like a little girl, or, I think Stephen King even did that scene with a toddler or something. But you can take something that should be powerless and turn it into just this frightening thing. And I'm thinking of, like, movies like Let the Right One In.
Right.
Where that's of course is another child, or even like A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, where you have a woman in a particular society where she shouldn't have that power, I guess. That's one of the things that I like about it, about the vampire lore, and that I hope more authors will take that and do more with it, because I think there's so much good material there, and good opportunity for story, just in this idea of looking at something that should be innocent, but it's not.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm thinking back to the old, I think it was a TV movie of Salem's Lot, where one of a boy of about 12 gets turned, and there's this great scene where he's like floating outside his friend's window, like knocking on the window to come in, and it's just, like I said, it's a TV movie, so it's not like the greatest special effects you'll ever see, but it's just such a creepy scene because it's like a kid, but it's a monster.
Well, that same sort of thing shows up in Justin Cronin's The Passage, too, which I know we had also kind of put on our list of things to possibly tackle in this episode, and where, for those of you who have not read the book, I don't want to give any spoilers, but there is a bit to do with a young girl who is used in ways by the government, who's researching the vampire. It's hard to explain.
Yeah, no, I did read the first one, The Passage, and I know what you're talking about. It was very well done, but kind of hard to read at times. Yes,
and Lisa and I were talking about this earlier before starting the recording, that the first book it's clear that he had a lot of time to really, really work on, like, honing the book. And then after it got picked up and was such a big seller, the sequel, it was clear that he had like a year or so to write it. And so the plot is okay, but the level of the prose is not as good as in the...
Yeah, I stopped after the first one. I didn't read. Is it the 12? Is that the second one or the third one?
I think that's the second one.
Okay, yeah, I didn't read that one.
I did, and I mean, I didn't dislike it, but like, there were moments in The Passage where the sentences were just gorgeous, and there just really wasn't any of that in the second book at all.
The writing was really, really beautiful in the first one.
Yeah, and that's why I kind of wanted to definitely make sure we kind of at least touched on the passage a little bit for those of you, because they're making it into a TV show apparently, and
I hadn't heard that.
I saw a trailer for it like a week or two ago, and I don't know if it's going to be on network TV or on like HBO or one of those things. Hopefully HBO or Showtime or something where they can be a little more bloody and brutal, but
right.
I don't remember.
Yeah, another adaptation that they're doing next year is Joe Hill's Nosferatu, which is another unique take on a vampire-like monster. I don't know if you guys have read that one. Oh,
yes.
Yeah.
That's a great one.
I agree. I'm really looking forward to see what they do with the TV show. I think he said it's going to be AMC, so they can get away with a little bit of stuff there.
Well, I mean, that's where Preacher and The Walking Dead air. So
exactly. Yeah, it can't be any grosser than The Walking Dead. Exactly. But yeah, I think that's. Go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, I didn't realize that they were making it into a show. I thought they might be adapting it into a movie, but I could see that as a TV show.
Yeah, it's gonna be a series. I actually just went to see Joe Hill the other night, and he was talking about the adaptation. I think it's a great take on the vampire theme with, the car that eats souls and Charlie Manx and all that. It's a really, really different take, but super well done and really creepy.
Yeah, I devoured that book. I read it really quickly.
Yeah.
I was trying to pace myself because I was enjoying it so much, but it was so good that I just kept going.
How about we wrap up with everybody's favorite obscure vampire book and or movie that nobody else has probably ever heard of?
Ooh.
Oh, that's difficult.
That'll be tough, but we can do it.
Really?
We can do it.
Okay. Well, we'll toss it to you then, since this was your idea.
All right, so that's fine. I have a couple. I have I didn't even realize this book was written by the person it was written by, because I read it so long ago, a book called Fever Dream, and it's about a vampire and the whole book takes place on a Mississippi riverboat, and that's where he does his thing. And it was actually written by George R.R. Martin before he became Game of Thrones guy. It was written probably late 70s, early 80s, I can't remember, but really cool vampire book. And for a movie, I remember watching this movie when I was a kid. You probably can't find it anywhere because it was, in reality, if I watch it now, it would probably be awful. It was called Count Yorga Vampire. And I don't remember anything about it other than I watched it when I was like 10 and it scared the crap out of me. So those are my two obscure vampire literary and film references.
All right, I guess I'll go next. I can't think of a literary one that would be obscure that, people haven't already read, but I will say probably... And this I'd say fits, but my favorite somewhat obscure vampire film would have to be Vampire's Kiss, starring Nicolas Cage. For those of you unfamiliar with it, it features some of the best acting that Nicolas Cage is capable of giving. And
that's not saying a lot.
Playing something undead.
It's one of his first movies. I think it's like, I just looked it up. It was 1988, and he plays a guy who has like this one night encounter with a woman that he meets at like a nightclub, and he becomes convinced that she was a vampire and that he's turning into a vampire. But you're never quite sure if he's actually becoming a vampire or if he's just slowly going crazy. And my favorite scene is when he goes and buys some of those fake plastic vampire fangs like, you had at Halloween when you were a kid, because he doesn't have real fangs. And it's very funny, but not always intentionally funny. So that's my pick, Vampire's Kiss.
Okay, well, mine... is Martin by George Romero. So we've been talking about all these, are they vampires or are they zombies? And kind of the king of the zombies made a vampire movie in the 70s, 1976, I think. And it's weird.
How have I not heard of this?
It's so good. Like it's got a lot of dark humor. So since you like Santa Clarita Diet, you might like it because it's not a straightforward horror film. It's got a lot of weirdness to it, and it's about this guy who's like kind of this loner who it's unclear whether or not he is a vampire or he just thinks he's a vampire. But he still goes out and kills people and drinks blood. So either way, he's a serial killer who is delusional, or he's a vampire. And he's got this weird family, and I don't know. It's just it's funny and charming and gross, and I don't know why more people don't talk about it. I
want to watch it.
Yeah, I don't know why more people don't talk about it. So, and I think it takes place in Pittsburgh, like the rest of Romero's. Anyway, it's good. So I would recommend it.
Yeah, I think it got overshadowed by Dawn of the Dead because it came out just a year or two before, and so people always talk about Dawn of the Dead. Martin's a good pick too.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard not to talk about the zombies when you're talking about Romero, but yeah, Martin, I almost wish he did more with vampires, but anyway. So yeah, Martin.
Oh, that's a good pick. I didn't know about that myself until we did the Romero episode. Okay. I think I'm going to go with a book, and I don't know how obscure it is, but it's on the top of my head because I'm reading it right now. And that's Joel Gomez's The Gilda Stories, which has an African-American woman as the central vampire and kind of takes her from the 1800s. I think I'm about halfway through, but I think it actually goes like into the future, still kind of the future for us. It was written in 1991, so it's probably only a couple of years from where we are right now. But so far, it's been really interesting how she's been kind of using the idea of a female vampire as her main character and the relationship between her and the history that she experiences. So I would say that would be my book pick. I don't know if I have a movie. I was thinking of Martin, like I said. So yeah, I guess that's that book. Well, I was thinking of the fact that vampires appeared in the original Doctor Who, and a priest tries to stop them with a cross, and they ignore it and they trample him. So
there you go.
I was thinking of that when you were talking about why don't crosses work anymore against vampires.
Oh my gosh! Now I want to go back and watch Martin.
I want to go watch Martin in 30 Days of Night and just not sleep.
Yeah. That sounds like a great plan to me.
Well, I guess that's probably a great place for us to go ahead and end it. And, I mean, this is the end of our series on vampires, and technically, I guess, the end of our season 2, because starting next, we're going to be doing our Summer of Sci-Fi again. So, thanks for listening.